Hello everyone, and thank you again for joining me here at the Joy of Carving. It's almost that time of year again, and what better way to celebrate Halloween than by carving pumpkins? And these ones thankfully are a little bit less messy than the ones we normally carve. So make yourself a cup of tea or a coffee, grab your whittling knife, and let's begin the joy of carving. The initial steps for these are fairly straightforward. So we're going to be taking that flat shape and we're just going to be rounding the edges. What we do have to be mindful of here though is the direction of the grain will constantly change because we're carving a circle, and we'll need to compensate for that by constantly changing the direction in which we're carving. So try and be mindful about how that wood feels as you're carving it, because if we don't change the direction, what can happen is we'll just splinter a large chunk of it off. Now if you've ordered the kit for this off my website, that design on the pumpkin will already be drawn on, but you'll find as you start to carve you'll be going over that design a little bit. That's absolutely fine because we need to round it, so just fill in the gaps, make sure you keep drawing that design back in so that we don't lose it. Use caution when you're carving that stalk. Just because it's going to be getting thinner, don't apply too much pressure because we don't want that to snap. In order to carve the base of the stalk, you can see that I'm going to be using a sort of V shape. Carefully press the knife in at one angle, then switch the angle onto the other side, and it will carve a nice flat base for you. Now that we have the rough shape, we can start carving in all of those details. So I'm carving in the lines of the pumpkin next, and I'm just beginning by drawing those lines in where I want them. And when you're happy with where you've drawn them, we can use the tip of the knife to gently school those lines in. So we're using the tip of the knife and we're using a lot of caution here. This doesn't take much force. If you use too much force, then you run the risk of slipping and pulling that knife in towards you, which you definitely don't want to do. So just very, very carefully do this, and you can go over the area a number of times if you have to. Each time that you go over, it will gradually get deeper and deeper. We're going to whittle in those lines with the exact same method that we used to carve that stalk, so we're carving that V shape again. And just be mindful not to apply too much pressure. Gently press on one side, switch it to the other, press it again until that chip of wood lifts out. And if you want to, you can do what I'm doing here, and I'm just using the edge of a piece of sandpaper to just gently smooth that line down, just to get rid of all of those little fragments of chips. And then we can repeat the exact same process with the other lines that we've drawn in. Now we can move on to the eyes. So like we did with the lines of the pumpkin, I'm using the very tip of the knife to carve in all around the line that we've drawn in there. And the trick here is to resist the urge to press that knife in really hard. Just go over the line a number of times if you have to, but don't press down because we can risk injury. So it gets a little bit more difficult here because we're using the very tip of the knife in order to carve out the eye socket. Sounds a little bit weird when I say it like that, but yeah, in order to carve out the eye socket, we're using the very tip of the knife. If you watched my video on how to sharpen, you'll know that I mentioned in that video that the tip is the weakest point. So we have to be really careful here about how we're sort of wobbling that knife. If we wobble it too much, if we put too much leverage on the tip of that knife, that tip can snap off. And then I'm just using some sandpaper there just to help smooth that area down, but you don't have to do this if you don't want to. Then we're going to use the exact same method to carve those nostrils, so exactly the same as the eye sockets, it's just on a much smaller scale. But again, just be mindful about how much pressure you're putting on the tip of that knife. So the method that we're using here is actually called chip carving, and it's a whole other art form aside from whittling, but we can effectively chip carve with our whittling knife as well, so it's a really good way to expand our range and our carving ability. Chip carving traditionally is done with a slightly different tool. It's sort of a flat angled knife, and it's used to create sort of geometric patterns on boxes and things, and it's a really beautiful art form in itself. The mouth is going to be in exactly the same method that we've been using, so we're going to score the lines in and then we're gently going to whittle the space out. However, what we do need to be careful of here is because we're carving all of those lines in where the stitches are, we need to be cautious that we don't chip off fragments of the wood. So really take your time and scoring the lines here. It really pays off spending the extra time scoring those lines slightly deeper just to prevent any pieces of the wood chipping off. I absolutely love this method of chip carving with the whittling knife because it's a really effective way to get extra details into your whittlings. If you have snapped the tip of that knife off though, don't panic, we can fix it. If you pop over to the channel, there's a video on sharpening, and in there I take you through how to fix that problem. But it happens to the best of us. Even now, from time to time, I'll still break the tip of my knife by accident by applying too much force. So now that I have the basis for that smile, I can begin by carving in all of those little stitches. So just take your time and put in that tiny bit of extra effort just to make sure that those lines are deep enough so that you're not going to fracture and chip out the surface of the wood. All of our pumpkins are going to follow the exact same methods in whittling. It's only the designs that are changing. So for the next minute, I'm just going to put the music on and let you watch this one without me bothering you. And there's our finished pumpkins, all whittled and carved. So these are pre-painted. I am going to paint these. You don't have to paint yours. You can just oil and varnish them if you want, or you don't have to do anything to them at all. And these are a great seasonal project to work on. You can get everyone in the family doing these instead of carving real pumpkins if you don't want the mess. And what's great about these is these won't turn into small piles of mush that have been left outside until Christmas. These are something that once you've made them, they will last for generations. I do hope that video was fun and useful for you. Please support the channel by liking and subscribing, and as always, happy carvings.